Hello again. Hello again. It is lovely to see you, even in my imagination. I know that you're there. It's lovely. Thank you for visiting this YouTube channel and spending a little bit of time with these offerings. I hope they're of help to you. We're going to talk this time about what mindfulness is not. This is kind of the companion, to the talk I just recorded a few minutes ago about what mindfulness is. These are brief, so we're just going to kind of skate along the surface. There's a huge amount that could be said about all this stuff that I'm choosing not to get into. But as I said in the first talk about what mindfulness is, this is a term that's become pretty well known. I think it's safe to say now that we're using a mainstream word. And that's interesting to me because it wasn't very long ago, at least in my experience here in the upper Midwest of the United States. It was not long ago at all that this term was completely unheard of outside of Buddhist communities. And now has become, it really has become mainstream in both. And what I mean by that is that implies in sacred settings, in other words, religious settings, in other words, Buddhist settings, but it's become mainstream, meaning secular. We see it now talked about in schools, and we see it now talked about in businesses, and we see it now talked about in medicine, in therapist's office. We see it talked about in all sorts of settings now, mindfulness. And so, as I said in the first talk about what mindfulness is, there's a huge number of resources available to you as a result of it being so widespread now. So that's kind of cool, right? There's a lot to be learned. Here, let me do this. Whoops, I like this better. Oh, there we go. So there's a lot to be learned from a lot of different teachers who have a lot of different perspectives on what this is. So as always, I encourage you to avail yourself of whatever's out there, and stuff that resonates with you, hang on to and repeat. Stuff that doesn't resonate with you, let it go for now. Maybe circle back later. So what we talked about in the first one is a very brief recap. Is mindfulness is generally speaking described as mindfulness is awareness of present moment perception, present moment experience, present moment arising of phenomena. I like just experience because some of those other words are a little heady. Present moment experience viewed through a non-judgmental lens. We're just not picking and choosing. We just notice. We just sort of notice what's happening right now. And generally, when we're training in mindfulness, when we're practicing strengthening that muscle that we call mindfulness, we usually choose one, perhaps two objects of focus: breath, body, emotions, thought, eating, walking, right? Just to give us a focus to come back to in the present moment, right? To practice getting better at our mindful awareness, something we already possess, but something we get better at noticing as we get better at discerning between non-mindful awareness, right? Judgmental awareness, critical awareness, introjected parent awareness, egoic awareness, whatever we want, analytical awareness. And mindfulness, we get better at noticing the difference, and we can kind of let one of those things fall away and just return to the kind of bare awareness that mindfulness implies. So what's implied in that is a radical acceptance. I love the term radical acceptance. That's kind of come into the fore in the past 10, 20 years in American Buddhism. And it implies an unqualified yes to what's happening. Because what mindfulness does not do is say, I like this, I want more of it, and I don't like this, I want less of it. It just notices, right? So we call that acceptance. I just recognize what's happening and I accept it. Right? This is starting to become now a stance of the heart. I'm going to leave more of that for another talk, but beyond just acceptance or non-judgmental awareness, you can kind of feel that as we get better at doing this, as we get better at remembering this quality of awareness that we already have, there's an invitation. There's an invitation kind of woven into that of, can you say yes to your life exactly as it is right now, without needing anything to be different, can you? Can you say yes to it? Because the understanding there is that's where contentment is, right? Contentment is just not needing anything to be different. So mindfulness pretty directly massages that area where human consciousness wants to say, I know it's happening, but I don't care for it. I don't accept it. I don't like it. This is really where mindfulness has its agency, because what's woven into the idea of mindfulness is that there's a yes there. It's just a yes. So we're talking about in this video, we're talking about what mindfulness isn't. And so I'm starting with that because most of us are aware that we pay attention to our experience as well as have our experience. Right? There's part of us that kind of watches. And we usually experience that, most of us, as kind of an inner critic. We call it the inner critic, we call it an inner judge. If it's particularly cranky, we call it an inner tyrant. In psychology, sometimes they call that superego or the introjected parent. It's kind of our sometimes we call it our conscience. Sometimes these things are distinguished from one another, but for today's purposes, let's call it that little voice in your head, the part of you that watches what you're doing, saying, oh, I don't think she likes you, try harder, or sit up straight before she comments on your posture. Yeah, I should really go to bed. Okay, I should really go to bed instead of watching one more episode of Ted Lasso, or whatever the thing is, right? That kind of voice in your head that watches, and primarily its function is to correct and keep us safe, right, socially. So it's there to offer advice, it's there to criticize, it's there to judge, it's there to define, it's there to compare, and to some degree, it's there to analyze and problem solve, right? So we can see its usefulness. We can also acknowledge that at its core, it is intended to help. It tends to sow the seeds of dissatisfaction. It tends to sow the seeds of fear, because judgment breeds fear, and criticism, even self-criticism, breeds fear and resistance in us. And yet the reason it's doing all that corrective, comparative, judging, analyzing, theoretically at least, is to help us stay safe, to help us fit in, to help us achieve, to help us, you can kind of feel it, right? Like it is designed, at least originally, to try to help. And yet much of its functioning, that introjected parent or that inner critic, is labeling, judging, ranking, organizing, comparing. We know the deal. So everything we have just described, regardless of what we call it, not mindfulness. Not mindfulness. Why? Because it has an agenda. It is a very specific agenda that's designed to keep us, right, conforming or achieving or attaching or pushing away, or, right, it has a very specific agenda for us. If it's not immediately apparent to you what the agenda of your inner critic is, just spend a little bit more time noticing it, and it won't take you long to discern, oh yeah, that's what you're after, isn't it, right? So it has a very specific agenda, and non-mindful awareness, that introjected parent, that kind of self-talk that we do, oftentimes is dissatisfied and is saying no to what is happening and wanting what is happening to be different. You will notice when you start to pay attention to it that much of its activity, a lot of its activity, is about, I like that, I want more of it, and I don't like that, I want less of it. Right? We call this picking and choosing in Zen, or we call it simply preferential awareness, the part of us that's like, I like it, I want more, I don't like it, I want less. I like it, I want more, I don't like it, I want less. Not mindfulness, right? Because mindfulness is that open pasture of, oh, I notice that this is what's happening. I recognize it and I accept it. That's all. Right? The labeling, the judging, the criticism, the condemning, the wishing it was otherwise, all that kind of stuff for right now is on hold. Nope, I'm not doing that right now. I'm staying in the realm of my awareness that's just about noticing. Just noticing, right? So mindfulness does not have the critical function. It does not have the analytical function. It does not have the comparison function. It does not have any of the preferential movement that we're used to in our normal waking consciousness. The second thing that mindfulness, there's a lot of other things that mindfulness is not, but the second thing I'll mention today is it doesn't by definition have a compassionate component. You could kind of see that I was sort of hinting that at some point we kind of wanted to grow into that implied in the acceptance is a yes that can actually grow, that can actually evolve into a kind embrace, eventually evolving into empathy, eventually even evolving into compassion. But strictly speaking, step 6 on the Buddhist Eightfold Path, mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is simply non-judgmental awareness. It's just supposed to be a clean mirror, just reflecting what is. And that's the metaphor that's oftentimes used in Buddhist scripture and Buddhist writings for that type of awareness. I'm just reflecting what's there. That's it. It's not being filtered through what I like, what I don't, what I want, what I don't want, any of that stuff. It's just reflecting what's there. Right? And so sometimes mindfulness meditation is described as polishing the mirror, right? Because we know how our own lens through which we view the world becomes occluded. It becomes opaque in a lot of ways by our history, by our preferences, by the things that have hurt us, by the things that we've wanted, just by the things that have happened to us. It's not a brokenness with us. It's just part of our experience on planet Earth, the way we tend to be drawn towards some things and drawn away from others, depending on what's happened to us, right? So mindfulness is that period of time where we just go, I'm just going to wipe this mirror clean and just see things as they are, right? But by itself, that does not imply compassion. It simply implies I recognize what's happening and I acknowledge it. Right? That's the yes. Oh, I see what's happening. Cool. Right? The third thing it is not for today's conversation is it doesn't necessarily imply understanding. It's just noticing. It's just noticing. It'd be like tasting a food while blindfolded that you had never had before. You don't have to know what it is you're tasting, what region of the world it's from, what the words you would use to describe the flavor are, all that kind of stuff. You're just having the experience of the flavor. Mindfulness of eating. It doesn't necessarily mean you understand the implications, the container in which that's happening, the history of how that experience came to be, where it's going to lead, any of that kind of stuff, right? So when we're very, very strict and we say present moment awareness, that's part of what that implies. No past, no future, just what's happening right now. So what we're doing here is we're not describing the faults with mindfulness. That's not what we're doing. We're not at all describing its faults. We're just being very, very specific about what the original teaching on this is what mindfulness actually is designed to show us, is you have a capacity of awareness, it's happening right now, that's just noticing what's happening. That's all. It's just noticing what's happening. And so when we choose to cultivate that capacity, to polish that mirror, to get better at encountering present moment experience without the filter, right? Without all of our preferences, without all of our history, without our ideas about the past and future, just to meet it bare. We are strengthening the muscle. We are strengthening the muscle of awareness that will eventually, naturally evolve to include empathy, kindness, that's the compassion part of Buddhism, and it will eventually evolve to include wisdom. That's the understanding of what's actually happening, right? Compassion and wisdom are how Buddha functions in the world. That's the Buddhist understanding, is Buddha in action in the world is simply the activity of compassion and the activity of wisdom, right? And by itself, mindfulness is sort of, this is the baseline we're going to practice and start with, trusting it's going to evolve. Non-judgmental will eventually become more than just accepting. It'll become kind. and then empathetic, and then even compassionate, right? And the ability to discern what's actually happening versus what is not actually happening will evolve at some point to become wise, deeply wise. I understand what's actually happening here, how it came to be based on the past, where it's likely to go based on my ideas of the future. Wow, it starts being a larger and larger container, right? All of our work in meditation, whether we call it Buddhist meditation or whether we call it secular mindfulness, the ultimate goal is actually just trusting awareness itself, right? Consciousness itself. Can we become more and more self-aware? Because we trust that the nature of awareness itself, consciousness itself, what we truly are, spirit, if you want to use Christian terminology, fundamentally already is compassionate, fundamentally already is discerning and wise. Those things are just woven in. But when we're in human bodies and we're new at trying to pay attention to our experience, when we're new to meditation, when we're new to self-observation, practicing mindfulness is not only a logical first step, it's actually kind of a necessary first step. We don't get to just go, I'm pretty much a sleeping person. I'm mostly unconscious most of the time. I'm mostly acting on impulse and ego and preference, which is rooted in my fear and rooted in my pain and rooted in my hurt, right? Rooted in my shame, rooted in my trauma. And I want to skip right to wisdom, and I'll skip right away to compassion. Wow, those are pretty lofty goals, right? There's a reason this stuff is taught in the order that it is. And the first meditation practice taught in Buddhism is, let's just do mindfulness. Where's your breath right now? Where's your body right now? We get pretty good at doing that. Then we move on. Where are your feelings right now? Do you know what you're feeling right now? Can you just name what that is? Can you just allow it to be there? Cool. When you get really pretty good at that, you move on. What are your impulses? What's really moving? What are your instincts telling you? What is that about? Do you have a sense of what that is? Can you just allow that? Accept that they're there? Okay, you can choose to act or choose not, but unless you're aware of them, you're on autopilot. You get pretty good at that. How about your thoughts? Can you be aware of where your thoughts are taking you? Where they tend to go? We start to notice patterns. Right? Are you aware of those things? Can you hold them in mindfulness? Right? We're developing an observer, and the observer gets larger and larger, becomes kinder and kinder, more and more spacious, wiser and wiser. Right? It always includes, it always expands. It always expands, and it always includes. So I hope you can feel, in a way, the difference between what we're describing and the introjected parent, the self-judge, the self-critic, the part of us that's always sit up straight, do it better, you can feel, because just the size of its agenda, the size of its mission are completely different things, right? So I hope that's helpful. There's a whole bunch of other things we could certainly talk about here, but I hope that gives you a start in exploring in your own experience what mindfulness is and what a mindfulness awareness kind of feels like and what mindfulness isn't. And kind of by contrast, what mindful experience doesn't feel like. So you get pretty good at knowing the difference, right? And hopefully that helps you in your own practice. If you're new to meditation, set a timer for 5 minutes, sit down and notice your body and breath, see what happens. Right? It's not something we can fail at. It's a no-fail proposition. Because as I said, the only goal is awareness, right? So when we notice being mindful and we notice not being mindful, they're both mindful. Wow. It's actually a no-lose proposition. So I encourage you, keep exploring. And as always, if you have questions, please put them in the comments section or seek me out. FlyingCloudZen.org is where you can find me and all of the offerings of the Flying Cloud Zen community. Thank you for your attention. More to come later, okay? Blessings to you. Bye-bye.